Hi, Ben. Today, we will talk a little bit more about insetting. In the last few months, we've seen tremendous interests on the topic of the land sector and removals guidance. We thought it would be really helpful to spend a little bit of time talking about insetting in particular, and you're our resident expert on this, so I have a few questions for you. The first one being, Ben, can you just walk us through what is insetting?
Yeah, absolutely. So insetting is an intervention within one company's supply chain, which is kind of opposed to offsetting, which is a reduction in emissions or an increase in removals that's occurring outside of a company's supply chain. So to just think about this visually, insetting, we're reducing emissions within our value chain. So we have within our suppliers, within operations that we directly source from, whereas offsetting occurs outside of our value chain and is used to reduce the emissions that happen within our value chain.
Okay, thanks. So it's quite funny. I think we've spoken about this before, but in some ways, it sounds like insetting is just applying a label to something that has happened for a long time, but it's just reducing emissions within your supply chain as opposed to outside of it for a given price.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I totally agree. In some sense, insetting is a bit of a buzzword, but I think there's a little bit more to it than that. So with the land sector removals guidance, it provides some framework to ensure that our insets are credible, that we're not double counting, and that, but also giving us a framework to get the full credit for these sorts of supply chain initiatives.
Okay. So I think there's more to it, and we'll get to that soon. But maybe, I know this is a very high level description of what insetting is as opposed to offsetting, but could you give me an example, perhaps more specifically, of how this would apply in the land sector?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take an example here of a cocoa farm. So if you're a chocolate company and you're procuring cocoa from a farm, prior to insetting, you might have, your farmers might be practicing some kind of full sun cocoa production where there's, a high potential for soil degradation, greater, higher carbon footprint associated with the cocoa that you purchase for them. The idea behind insetting is to say, let's make a direct supply chain intervention within our value chain, something that is going to be initiated or funded by the purchasing company, and some sort of contractual mechanism to say, we're going to help you improve the agroforestry practices within your farm so that we can claim a lower emission profile for the products that we purchase for you. And as the AI image generator has helpfully produced for us here, the agroforestry practices, in essence, we're going to have increased tree biomass through things like shade trees, soil carbon sequestration. But the end result of this inset is that the cocoa that this chocolate company buys has a lower emission factor relative to the cocoa that this company bought prior to the inset. And so the advantage for the company procuring this is, of course, that they could get the lower emission factor, but they have direct line of sight because it's within their value chain, and they can help ensure the credibility of it and also ensure that these claims are not getting bundled and sold elsewhere as offsets.
Okay, got it. So it's a different way of looking at the point that was raised earlier, which is in some ways, this is kind of, decarbonization 101, where you talk about things like improved agroforestry practices, but with the caveat that it is all within a specific company's supply chain, the one that is kind of claiming the insets, as it were.
Yeah.
So Ben, now that we have this understanding of what insetting is, can you help me understand what is the change that has happened exactly? Why is it that companies all of a sudden are speaking to Terrascope about this topic?
In some ways, not a lot has changed. In some ways, other things have. So I think sometime around 2008, we get this term insetting. And so with the release of the land sector and removals guidance is essentially defining some accounting criteria around what it means to do insetting. And so the big difference, I think, in my mind, is when we think of offsets, for example. The difference between an inset and an offset is really the type of accounting method. So hopefully, I have one more slide here, courtesy of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Land Sector and Removals Guidance, which is offsets and offset credits in particular are calculated according to what is under some intervention and what could have been. And the difference between what is and some hypothetical or, grounded in reality counterfactual is the offset. And so those emissions take the form of like a lump sum, right? And so they can be then packaged, creditized, and sold to another company as a way to offset the emissions that they're doing. Inventory accounting is just what is or what has been. So it's what we measured the emissions that occurred in one year, and then we measured the emissions that occurred in the next year. And what an inset is trying to do is to contribute to a reduction between those two. But we're not concerned with what could have been. We're only concerned with what is.
Yeah, this is really powerful, because I think what I'm taking away from this is the project accounting method that you illustrated there really just should result in increased confidence regarding a given outcome, right, of the emissions reductions.
Right. Because under the project-based accounting, it necessitates a counterfactual scenario, and so there's always some, I think, a higher degree of uncertainty there in terms of what actually would have been, and furthermore, a certain level of trust maybe that has to be put into the practitioner to accurately state what is and what would have been.
I see. So it's increased confidence in the fact and trust in the fact that the reduction may have happened, but it's also increased responsibility on the practitioner to make sure that that's the case. So there's a lot of implications to this.
Yeah, absolutely. A high quality inventory accounting is essential for insetting, and also what comes along with that inventory method of accounting, the way we all do our corporate carbon footprints, is that there's a level of credibility that I think is hard to achieve under that project-based accounting.
Got it. So tell me what, before we talk about kind of the implications to carbon accounting and your inventory, et cetera, which we'll get to, let's stick to this fact that you have kind of, increased confidence, trust, probably from insets, but also this increased responsibility. Why is this? What matters about this? Why is it important?
Why is it important? Well, an inset is just a subset within the broader category of supply chain interventions. So this is one tool you have within your toolkit to help reduce emissions, particularly within Scope 3. Why this matters is because, for me personally, something like offsets have become subject to a lot of claims of greenwashing, whereas an inset is something that lends itself to more credibility, particularly under the Land Sector and Removals Guidance, which gives us the criteria to make sure it's robust, that there's no net harm, that we're not double counting, right? And these are the sorts of things that companies need to be investing in I mean, everyone, but in particular, those that have SBTi targets. A lot of companies that we work with have near-term targets that are, their target year is 2030. That's 4 years away. And so what are our mechanisms? What are the ways in which we can credibly reduce emissions within our corporate inventory? Insets under LSRG are a good one.
Okay. What I'm picking up from you is that especially companies that have set these decarbonization goals, right? There's now more visibility into how you can credibly make progress against those goals.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just visibility, it's credibility. It's credibility to say, here are the things that you can do, and here's how we can make sure that you get credit for them. Because I think the sort of world in which, we're going out and doing things that, are intended to do good, but at the end of the day don't reflect in the accounting. And so this provides a mechanism for us to get credit for some of these things.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we see that a lot. We speak with clients that just really, face a lot of pressure. If you're a sustainability manager, chief sustainability officer, you need to make sure that if you're spending the money and making the effort to decarbonize, that it's really getting properly reflected and that you're getting the credit for it. And it seems like this is just one of the avenues to facilitate more of that happening.
Absolutely. And I think when we think about sustainability more broadly, it's difficult because sustainability is a word that we made up. And so what exactly does it mean? I think in the context of the land sector and removals guidance, it brings a bit of a quantitative lens to what it means to be sustainable within the land sector.
Got it. Okay, Ben. Well, anything else that you'd want to add on this topic?
I think the final thing I'll say is the draft of this guidance has been out since 2022. And here we are in Q4 2025, which is the stated release time period from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol on the final version of this guidance. And so there are lots of knock-on implications for other reporting protocols, standards, and things like that. But if you're not up to speed on it, the draft is out right now, and it's expected to be finalized within the next couple months. And so I would just get a jump on it.
Yeah. Perfect. And how can Terrascope help?
How can Terrascope help? Terrascope can help in a lot of ways. First of all, you have access to our in-house experts, such as myself, to help you, get familiar with a lot of these evolving, landscape of regulations. I sat on the land sector and removals guidance technical working group and a chapter drafting team, but also not to steal the limelight here, but we have an incredibly robust platform that makes this, that facilitates this sort of accounting and makes it, makes it data ready for you to ingest your activity data, have this sorts of, breakdowns of gases, different types of carbon pools, all the things that you going to need to adhere to with this guidance, ready at your fingertips.
Perfect. Thinking, Ben, is there a specific example that might be useful to share with folks about this?
We're working with a client right now who sells rice within their retail stores. And they have worked directly with their supplier and their supplier's rice farmers to implement an inset. They've directly invested in helping these farmers implement low methane emission rice production practices. And so land sector guidance has all kinds of rules about every molecule of carbon that's happening within these rice farms. And what they've done is gone out and gone all the way to the extent of putting in gas measurement chambers on these smallholder rice farmers in Thailand. And what they've come to find out is that they were able to implement alternate wet-dry practices on these farms without the use of laser leveling, which is actually quite a big deal because normally that's the biggest impediment for being able to implement these things. But they've found a reduction in the rice per kilogram rice that they procure from the supplier of 40%.
Wow.
40%.
Wow.
Yeah. Pretty amazing. And we were able to take the primary data that they collected from their farmers and from the supplier, load it onto the platform, and be able to show them comparative analysis between generic supplier, conventional methods in Thailand, other producing countries, and give them a lot of insight into how much value this initiative has created for them, and given them, the talking points needed to take the leadership to sort of expand this thing, to roll it out to other types of projects, not just rice, but coffee, but beef and dairy and things of that nature. So pretty cool.
Wow, that's a fascinating example, and it's not every day that you hear these case studies of reductions of to 40% in emissions in certainly in agriculture. Thank you for sharing that example. And I think with that, we will wrap up our conversation today. For whoever's listening, if you are interested in this topic and think you might benefit from speaking with someone like Ben on this, we're offering free consultations on this topic. Please check it out on our website or reach out to Ben or myself directly on something like LinkedIn. We'd love to speak with you. We, as you can tell here, have worked with some of the leading companies in the world to measure and reduce their carbon emissions throughout the supply chain in the land, nature, and net zero economy sectors. So we would love to speak with you. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you, Ben, once again for your time as well. Take care.